This is the redesigned 2019 Jeep Cherokee, and it's a type of small-ish SUV that typically gets compared to vehicles like the Honda CR-V and Subaru Forester. But today, we're not going to be comparing it to its modern rivals. Instead, we're going to see how it stacks up against Dad and Grandpa. The beginning is usually a good place to start, so let me introduce you to this, a 1978 Jeep Cherokee, also known as the FSJ. Now, you're probably most familiar with this body style as a later Grand Wagoneer, but before Jeep got all grandiose, there was just the entry-level four-door Cherokee like this thing here, and a more lavishly equipped Wagoneer model. You can kind of think of it as the same relationship as a modern Chevy Tahoe and Cadillac Escalade, if the Tahoe had steel wheels, crank windows, and a bench seat. Although Jeep made a version of this FSJ through 1991, it was actually designed in the early 1960s, which means there's some proper truck stuff going on here. In fact, this was introduced over a decade before Jeep would coin the term SUV. In its day, this was known as a four-wheel drive station wagon. But back to that truck stuff. This Cherokee has a separate frame, solid axles front and rear, and the kind of thick metal bodywork you could build a bomb shelter out of. And under this nuclear grade hood, you'll find a hairy-chested V8 motor. Okay, so it's more like a hairy-chested V8 that's been waxed. Even though this is a 5.9 liter, it only had 175 horsepower when new. And that's because of all the emissions stuff that was going on in the late 1970s. But it did have a pretty decent 285 pound-feet of torque, and it was more powerful than the straight six that came standard in these. And if you wanted more power, Jeep had you covered there too. They sold a version of this motor with a 4-barrel carburetor, and there's also a 401 V8 on offer. Now, a couple interesting things to note about this generation of Cherokee. This was built under the ownership of AMC, which is another way of saying it was built without much money. The carburetor on this came from Ford, and the 3-speed automatic transmission was sourced from General Motors. But this did have a full-time 4-wheel drive system, which was pretty advanced for the day. And now we move on to this, a second-generation Cherokee known as the XJ. Jeep built the XJ Cherokee from 1984 all the way through 2001, and this particular example comes from the 1999 model year. Now, Jeep made some pretty big changes for this generation of Cherokee, the biggest of which was the switch from body and frame to unibody construction. Basically, this doesn't have a separate frame. The chassis and body are kind of one big unit in this, a lot like a modern SUV. In fact, you can make the argument that this was the world's first crossover, but just because the XJ Cherokee got some modern construction, don't think it went all soft. This still had solid axles front and rear and available four-wheel drive systems that were actually intended to go off-road. Another change for this generation of Cherokee is it was no longer designated as a base model only. Now, most XJ Cherokees were pretty basic. Things like power windows, cruise control, even a tachometer were optional. But Jeep introduced a new luxury trim line called Limited, like this one here. You can kind of think of it as a Wagoneer in a smaller package. It got some nice touches like leather seats, wood trim, an overhead console, fog lights, and some fancy alloy wheels. And the XJ Cherokee also made some good strides on the safety front. Later models came standard with dual front airbags, and you could also get anti-lock brakes on these. This generation Cherokee was smaller and lighter than the original, which meant it no longer needed a V8. Instead, most got a 4-liter straight 6 like you see here. But this was designed under AMC, so there's still some wackiness going on. In the early days, the XJ came standard with an inline 4-cylinder that was designed by AMC and an optional V6 that was bought from GM. However, the really strange part was that 4-cylinder had more horsepower than the optional V6, which I imagine made for a pretty difficult upsell. And finally, we move on to this, the new Cherokee, internally known as the KL. This body style of Cherokee came out for 2014, and this 2019 model represents the line's first major overhaul. Like the XJ Cherokee, this is a unibody, but all the hardcore SUV stuff like the solid axles front and rear are long gone. In their place is an independent suspension front and rear, much like a modern car. And that's no coincidence either. This is actually car-based. The chassis under this is the same general platform that was used for the Dodge Dart compact sedan. Under the hood of this new Cherokee, you still get a few different engine options. The base engine is a 2.4 liter naturally aspirated 4-cylinder, and there's also a larger 3.2 liter V6 on offer. This particular model comes with the new 2-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder engine. It's basically the same motor they use in the Alfa Romeo Giulia sports sedan. That means this has an impressive 270 horsepower and 295 pound-feet of torque. And of course, it's a Jeep, so you can get it with 4-wheel drive, and it comes with a 9-speed automatic transmission, which is more gears than the previous 2 Cherokees combined. And now it's time to talk about exterior styling, which is unfortunate for the new Cherokee. The FSJ and the XJ are two of the most iconic SUV designs of all time, right up there with the Range Rover and the G-Wagon. So the deck was stacked against this Cherokee right from the start, but it didn't help that Jeep phoned it in. When I first saw the 2014 Cherokee, I honestly thought it was a joke. It had this weird sloping hood and these headlights that weren't headlights. It was just kind of a mess. But luckily, Jeep was able to clean up a lot of that with this 2019 redesign. It's got the headlights where you'd expect to find headlights and fog lights down there. And overall, I do think it looks a lot better. But I don't think people are going to be collecting this in 20 or 40 years' time. And I think Jeep missed an opportunity there. They really could have included some classic Jeep design cues in this and made it a really cool, boxy SUV. Now, the XJ and the FSJ are separated by 20 years, but they still have a lot of similarities. If you look at the front ends, the designs are pretty much the same. I mean, that one's got round headlights and this one's square and the grills are a little different, but overall they look a lot alike. If you look down the side, they both have fender flares and kind of character lines that go the whole way, and in the back they both have vertical lights. Now this Cherokee doesn't have any of that. The only similarity I can find between this and either of these is the 7-slot grille. So now let's talk interiors, and we'll start here with the FSJ, and this shouldn't take long because frankly there's not a whole lot here. This is a base model from the 1970s and there's not a lot in the way of frills. Now let's start with the dash. Now normally glove boxes are over here on the passenger side, but this one's actually centrally located here in the middle. That's kind of unusual. And for the infotainment in the vintage Jeep, you'll find just a regular radio. It doesn't even have 8-track or tape or anything like that. It only has one speaker right here on top of the dash, but I guess it saved them on speaker wire. Now this spot over here is reserved for the clock, which was optional, and the original owner did not get that, but you did get a standard ashtray because it's the 1970s. Now the gauge cluster is actually pretty comprehensive. You get things like oil pressure and amps. You don't really get that in a lot of modern cars, but back then they often did. Now the controls for the heater and fan are over here. That's kind of an unusual placement, but I guess they just thought the driver only needed to use it, so they put it over there. Now this car does have the optional AC unit, and they just kind of slapped it to the bottom of the dash here, and all the controls for it are here instead of with the rest of them. Now this has dual bench seats. They're both covered in this retro vinyl pattern. They look pretty awesome. And on the back of the front seat, there is an ashtray because again, everyone smoked in the 1970s. Now one cool thing about this is they left the tops of the doors painted. It's just the exterior color. They didn't put the fabric all the way to the top. And on this one, whoever rode shotgun for most of their life put their arm on the door and it's actually worn the paint down there, and I really like that. The tailgate in this is pretty cool too. The window rolls down and the tailgate opens like a pickup truck. And now onto the interior of the XJ Cherokee. This is light years ahead of the FSJ. It feels like a modern car in here. I've got an airbag steering wheel with buttons on it for the cruise control, a center stack that goes right into the center console with a floor-mounted gear lever like a modern car. It's got a radio with more than one speaker, and instead of having an AC unit just slapped to the bottom of the dash, I've got integrated climate controls. Now there are a couple of cool old school touches in here. Instead of just using normal buttons for the rear defrost, wiper, and the front fog lights, Jeep went with these cool toggle switches. I really like that. And although it wasn't old school for the time, this has a lever for the four-wheel drive system. No computers to do it all for you in here. Now this is the limited model, which means it was the most luxurious Cherokee you could buy in 1999. Now with that limited package, you've got leather seats, this fake wood trim on the dash and on the doors, and this cool overhead console that had a digital readout for things like compass and average fuel economy. That was pretty advanced for the day. Even though this was the nicest Cherokee you could buy in 1999, I wouldn't exactly call it luxurious. The plastics are kind of thin and cheap sounding, and you can see screw heads pretty much everywhere. But that's just what an SUV was back then. It was a utilitarian vehicle. It would be years after this until the concept of a luxury SUV really took hold. But you did get a couple of nice convenience features in this. You got power windows, power locks, and power side mirrors. And now onto the interior of the new Cherokee, which is obviously the most modern looking of the bunch with its requisite screens and buttons kind of everywhere. And let's start here with this infotainment screen. This runs Chrysler's latest version of Uconnect, which means it's pretty good. It's fast to respond and it's got good resolution, and overall it's just easy to use. And even if you don't like Uconnect, it runs Apple CarPlay, so you've got that option. There's another LCD screen in the gauge cluster, and it's really high resolution too, and it's fully configurable, which is nice because you can put the information you want there. Now the gauges in this are pretty much the only old school throwback styling cue in this, and they got orange needles. They just kind of look very retro, and I like that. I wish they would have drummed this up for the rest of the interior. And of course, you've got buttons on the steering wheel for your adaptive cruise control and all your radio functions. I also like that the HVAC controls are these big buttons and these chunky knobs. It makes them really easy to use. However, I do wish there was actual physical buttons for things like the heated seats, the heated steering wheel. You have to go into the infotainment system, and that's slightly annoying, but it's not a deal breaker. And the materials in here are also really nice too. It's all soft touch on the dash and doors, and you even get some stitching. The leather feels nice. It just feels like a more premium vehicle than you'd expect from a Cherokee. There are some cheap plastic things, but in this price point, you're to expect that. And I got a big sunshine roof up here. All right, now let's see how these things drive. Okay, I'm behind the wheel of the original Cherokee, and suddenly it's the 1970s all over again. Now, first impressions is it's actually pretty comfortable to drive. Even though this is body on frame with solid axles, it actually rides pretty nice and comfortably. And the steering is nice and light in it too. It's not truck-like at all. I can see why Jeep used this as a basis of their first luxury SUV model. Although the ride in this is actually more luxurious than I thought. There ain't a lot of luxury going on in this interior. I'm sitting on a bench seat, I've got crank windows, and I've got a single speaker radio in here. There's just not a lot. This was the base model, and this is a base model in the true sense of it. This even had an optional clock, and the original owner did not spring for that option. Visibility in this is excellent. You sit up really high, and because this was developed decades before any kind of rollover standards, all the pillars are just toothpick thin, and there's glass everywhere. So even though this is a relatively large vehicle, this light steering and excellent visibility make it pretty easy to drive. This old girl is actually pretty sprightly. Now obviously it's not fast, but it really doesn't have any trouble keeping up with modern traffic. And the brakes are pretty good in this too. The earlier FSJs had drum brakes in the front, but this has discs, so I'm not fearing for my life every time I come to a stoplight. All right, here we are behind the wheel of the 1999 XJ Cherokee, and right off the bat, I can tell you it is far more cramped than the FSJ. Not only is it narrower, you'd expect that it's a smaller car, but there's hardly any headroom. I'm only about 6 foot tall, and my head is almost on the ceiling here. If I was wearing any kind of hat, I might not fit in here. But on the upside, this does have thin pillars like the FSJ, so visibility is actually pretty good. You can see pretty much everywhere. I just wouldn't want to get in a rollover crash with this. The 6-cylinder in this actually offers pretty good power off the line. It's got good low down grunt. It does kind of lose steam once you get going, but it's got a lot of torque down low. You can tell this was designed at a time when off-road ability was important for an SUV. You kind of need that low down torque to go over mountains, and this thing had it. Even though this is a unibody and smaller than the FSJ, it still feels like a substantial SUV. It doesn't feel like a little truck that's going to get knocked over by a stiff wind. And on the ride front, this actually drives a lot like the FSJ. It's got this comfortable ride in it. The seats are really cushy. I mean, you do get some bumps and jitters. I mean, it's got live axles, so it's never going to drive like a modern SUV, but it's surprisingly comfortable. The steering is heavier than you'd find in the FSJ, but it actually feels quite good. It's got a little bit of weight. It's just that old school hydraulic feeling that you don't really get anymore. And the brakes are very good too. This is smaller and lighter, and it still has disc brakes in the front, so you don't have to worry about stopping. The interior of this XJ is much quieter than that of the FSJ. You can really tell that Jeep put some effort into making this calming and more comfortable to drive than the previous Cherokee. That being said, it is still a little bit louder than a modern car. You get some road noise, some wind noise, and this engine is actually pretty loud. But you can see that Jeep was trying to progress the SUV from just some off-road toy to something you could actually drive every day. And this Cherokee was really instrumental in pushing the SUV as just a normal car. All right, here we are behind the wheel of the 2019 Jeep Cherokee. Now, before I dive into the specifics of this vehicle, I just wanted to highlight how much has changed in the automotive world over the last 20 years. It worked out that all these vehicles were about 20 years apart, and the leap from the FSJ to the XJ was pretty big. There's a lot of new technology stuff, ABS, front airbags, there's some convenience features, power windows, cruise control, that kind of stuff. But the leap from the XJ to this is just astonishing. I mean, this has so much futuristic stuff compared to it. It's got adaptive cruise control, touchscreen infotainment, infotainment system, a heated steering wheel. It's just amazing how far the industry has progressed over the last 20 years compared to the 20 years before it. As far as the ride goes, it's surprisingly comfortable. The other two kind of felt like trucks. I mean, they have live axles and they were basically built to go off-roading. This was more built for on-road and, you know, occasionally going off-road somewhere. Nothing too hardcore. And it feels like it. It feels comfortable behind the wheel. You don't really get any bumps from the road. It's well isolated. It's quiet. It's just kind of a nice place to be. And the seats are really comfortable. It's easily the most comfortable of the three, which is not a huge surprise. As I mentioned earlier, this has the 2-liter engine in it, which is actually the smallest in the Cherokee lineup, but it does have that turbo, which means it's got pretty good punch. However, it is handicapped by this 9-speed automatic transmission. This just refuses to downshift, especially if you're going uphill. If you put your foot into it, the revs go up by maybe 1,000. There have to be more. You have 9 gears. There's more to pick from. Pick a different one. There is a manual mode, but it's kind of annoying that you have to go into the manual and pick the right one for the car. Why doesn't it know what to do? All right, I found a curvy road, so let's move the select train down to sport and see what this Cherokee can do. I've got a shocking revelation. This isn't very good at back roads. Although this Cherokee isn't the kind of vehicle you want to push around corners, the steering in it is actually pretty good. It's got a decent amount of weight to it, and it's pretty linear and direct. The space in here is pretty good. I got plenty of room up here. The second row seat's got plenty of leg and headroom. The packaging, I would say, is not up to like Honda CR-V standards. There's just not cubby spaces everywhere, but you do have a storage spot on the bottom of the center stack. The center console is pretty generous, and you got some door pockets. So it's if you have a family, this will be perfectly fine. It's just not at the very top in terms of packaging. So we've already determined this doesn't look like a Cherokee, but does it drive like one? After spending some time behind the wheel, I'm struggling to find any similarities between this and the 2 older Cherokee models. And that's probably for the best. Those cars came from a completely different era. SUVs weren't all the craze. There wasn't that much competition. This is in a fiercely competitive market now, and it has to compete with the Toyotas and Hondas of the world. And I think they've done a pretty good job of this. It's comfortable to drive, it's quiet, it's relaxing. So while it doesn't have that truck-like feeling that a lot of people like in the older Cherokees, I think it's okay that this has moved on and it's a more modern vehicle now. All that being said, I do wish Jeep would have found a way to throw some old school Cherokee design cues in the interior. But in here, there's nothing really that says Cherokee to me. And I know Jeep can do that. I mean, if you look at the new Wrangler, that still just looks like a classic Wrangler inside, but it's got a lot of modern features, a lot of the modern features this has. I wish Jeep would have put that know-how into this car. Now, I'm not sure how much that really matters to the average buyer who's shopping just for a smallish SUV. They probably don't care, but I wish they would have done that just to kind of preserve the Cherokee nameplate a little more. So there you have it, the redesigned 2019 Jeep Cherokee, a good little SUV that has absolutely nothing to do with the previous 2 Cherokees. I do wish Jeep would have found a way to put some classic design cues back into this, but I guess we'll just have to wait until next time. No one's really making a small, boxy SUV right now, and that's Jeep's wheelhouse, so hopefully they get back to it. But back to this Cherokee here. I actually like this more than I thought I would. It's really comfortable. The suspension's set up well, and the front seats are cushy and supportive. And there's enough room in the second row for the kids, and it's got a generous cargo area, so this should be a good family vehicle. The interior is also well appointed. The materials are nice, and there's a lot of good available tech like adaptive cruise control and lane keep assist. There's also that new Uconnect infotainment system that runs Apple CarPlay. And this 2-liter engine's pretty good too. Thanks to that turbo, it's got good grunt off the line, but it still gets almost 30 miles per gallon on the highway. However, the weak link is the 9-speed auto, which is frankly not very good, and hopefully Jeep and Chrysler in general are able to fix that at some point because it's been a problem for quite a while. And so concludes my tale of 3 Cherokees. I hope you enjoyed this little stroll down memory lane. After spending time with all 3 of these Cherokees, I can easily say that the newest one is the best vehicle here. It's better built, it's got more convenience features, and it was designed with modern safety standards in mind. But it's not the best Cherokee here, not by a long shot. These first 2 Cherokees just have so much character and soul. They're the kind of cars you give nicknames to. In comparison, the new one is kind of just a generic small SUV that everyone's going to forget in a few years' time. And that's a real shame for a vehicle with such an iconic nameplate. So Jeep, if you're watching this, please bring back the box. And for the rest of you, don't forget to like and subscribe. Oh, they don't make them like they used to. Oh.